They were once told that a black man would never wear the crown of the heavyweight champion of the world. They insisted he lacked the discipline, the intelligence, the character needed to stand toe-to-toe with white title holders. Yet on a burning day in Sydney, Australia, Jack Johnson would break every belief and rewrite what the world thought possible. The white boxing world thought it was ridiculous. In smoky gyms and elite athletic clubs, the idea was mocked. A black man as heavyweight champion? It was treated like a joke, something to laugh about with cigars and whiskey in hand. These men saw the world as already arranged, a natural order they believed could never be touched. At the top, white champions. Below them, everyone else. The thought of a black man taking the greatest prize in the sport wasn't only unlikely, it was insulting to them, a direct challenge to the very beliefs they clung to. Across boxing circles, in America, when Jack Johnson's name appeared in conversation in the early 1900s, it drew smirks and sarcastic remarks. Yes, he had wins. Yes, he had beaten black fighters and a few white ones who dared face him. But the world heavyweight title? That was reserved for men like John L. Sullivan, James J. Corbett, and the reigning champion Tommy Burns. These were the men the newspapers celebrated, the faces schoolboys looked up to, the heroes of a country that treated boxing as a test of manhood and racial domination. Johnson did not belong in that world, they said. When he chased the title, he was ignored, insulted, told to stop dreaming. The color line in boxing was not hidden, it was bold and undeniable. After the first black heavyweight champion decades earlier, white boxing leaders vowed it would never happen again. Sullivan himself said plainly he would fight any man alive except a black one. But Jack Johnson did not accept the limits others built for him. Born in Galveston, Texas in 1878, he grew up in hard conditions. The son of former slaves, he knew hunger, brutal work, and the crushing pressure of Jim Crow laws pressing down on every breath. Yet Johnson held something powerful inside him, an unbreakable belief in his value. He learned to fight on the streets and in small clubs, earning tiny pay, learning to read movements, to glide and strike, to think ahead. By his 20s, he was already different from every fighter around him. He was not only strong and tall, not only blessed with reflexes that seemed almost unreal. He had a mind tuned to the sport. He studied his rivals carefully, noticed their habits, watched their footwork. In an era when many fighters relied on pure power, Johnson relied on strategy. What truly set him apart was that he refused to act the way society demanded a black man act. He did not lower his voice or bow his head. He did not hide his pride or shrink in the presence of white critics. Johnson was bold, confident, almost theatrical. He wore expensive clothes, drove luxury cars, and lived how he chose. Every action was a direct challenge to a country that expected obedience. This made him dangerous in the eyes of many, not only inside the ropes, but beyond them. A black man who succeeded was tolerated only if he stayed quiet. Johnson refused to. He lived like the world belonged to him, and that terrified many white Americans. By 1908, Johnson had beaten every opponent willing to face him. He chased Tommy Burns around the globe, refusing to let the champion hide. Burns, the Canadian champion, defended his belt often, but would not fight Johnson. The risk was too great, but Johnson kept pursuing him, following him to England, to France, taunting him in newspapers and public halls. Eventually, the pressure became overwhelming. An Australian promoter offered a massive payout, and Burns agreed, thinking he would defeat Johnson and shut him up once and for all. Reporters predicted an easy victory. They wrote that Burns's skill and cleverness would break Johnson. Many did not hide their belief in white supremacy, saying openly that a white fighter could not lose to a black challenger. Johnson arrived in Australia early, trained in the open, and spoke confidently to the press. He told them he would win easily, that Burns was not at his level. Some in the local press admired his confidence. Others were offended by it. How dare he speak like this? But Johnson had already spent a lifetime being told to stay in his place. He had stopped listening long ago. December 26, 1908, Boxing Day, Rushcutters Bay in Sydney. A stadium thrown together quickly but packed with more than 20,000 spectators. Most came expecting a white champion to triumph and put the challenger back in the position they believed he belonged. The air was thick with heat and intensity. When Johnson entered, the crowd's reaction mixed between curiosity and hostility. Some cheered, many shouted insults. Johnson smiled as though it were nothing. Burns entered to loud cheers. The referee spoke. The fighters returned to their corners. The bell rang. Within moments, everything the boxing world believed began to crumble. Johnson moved with ease, slipping punches, dancing lightly across the canvas. Burns looked slow, uncertain. Johnson countered cleanly, landing precise blows. By the second round, Burns was falling apart, blood along his lip, swelling around his eye. Johnson was not only winning, he was controlling the fight with ease, talking to Burns as he punished him. "Come on, Tommy, that all you got?" Johnson grinned while proving them wrong. The crowd's loud energy fell to silence. Their champion, the proof of their belief in superiority, looked helpless. Round after round the beating continued. Burns held on, showing bravery, but courage alone could not save him. By the 14th round, the sight was painful to witness. Police stepped in and stopped the fight. Johnson had won. A black man was the heavyweight champion of the world. Silence spread across the stadium as reality set in. The natural order, as they believed it to be, had fallen apart in front of their eyes. Johnson stood tall, smiling proudly. He had done what he was told was impossible, but he would soon learn that winning the title was only one battle. The real fight was surviving what came next. America refused to accept him. Newspapers exploded with the story. In the South, violence broke out. White mobs attacked black citizens. In northern cities, the same pattern followed. A black champion was treated as a threat. The press, once dismissive, now scrambled to explain the defeat. Some admitted Johnson's brilliance. Others claimed Burns was sick or past his prime, anything to protect their pride. They searched desperately for a great white hope, someone who could restore what they believed was the world's rightful order. But in that moment in Sydney, with the belt around his waist, none of that mattered to Johnson. He had proven them wrong. Every limit placed on him had been broken. He knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but for that day, victory was his. The world had seen something it could never unsee. A black man had stood against history, against doubt, against hatred, and he had refused to bow. And even as anger rose and challenges waited around the corner, Jack Johnson stood smiling, knowing he had earned his place at the top, that any number of white boxers could defeat Johnson if simply given the opportunity. The answer, they argued, was to find a great white hope, a white champion who would take back the title and restore what they believed was the proper order of the world. This idea was not hidden. The prejudice was open, spoken clearly in newspapers and magazines. Writers claimed that white honor demanded Johnson be beaten. The mission to find someone to defeat him became almost a national duty. It was treated with the seriousness of a military search. Johnson returned to America as the champion, but he was not welcomed as a hero. He was met with distrust and anger, viewed as a danger instead of a champion. In many parts of the country, he was banned from eating in white restaurants, staying in white hotels, or using white facilities. Champion or not, Jim Crow rules still followed him everywhere. But Johnson refused to live as a second-class person. He purchased luxury cars, owned several homes, and wore custom-designed suits. He opened his own elegant club in Chicago called the Café de Champion, where black and white guests mixed freely, shocking many people of that time, and most boldly he dated and married white women, This, more than anything else, painted a target on his back. Interracial relationships were illegal in many states and deeply forbidden across the country. For a black man to proudly date white women, to show those relationships openly in public, was seen as the greatest rebellion. Johnson did not hide or whisper. He brought these women to public events, married them in ceremonies covered by newspapers, and lived his life openly. Every relationship was treated like a scandal, used as proof that he was dangerous and must be stopped. But Johnson would not bow to rules meant to keep him small. He had been told his place his entire life, and now as champion he chose to stand wherever he wished. The boxing world became desperate to find someone who could beat him. Former champions were asked to return. Stanley Ketchel, a middleweight and clearly smaller, faced Johnson in 1909. It was supposed to be only an exhibition, but Ketchel tried to surprise him with a real knockout punch and even managed to knock him down for a moment. Johnson rose, furious, and knocked Ketchel out with a punch so strong it reportedly broke his teeth. The Great White Hope search grew louder. Promoters searched across America and Europe for someone who could challenge Johnson. They pressured James J. Jeffries, a retired champion who had left the sport undefeated. Jeffries enjoyed his peaceful farm life and resisted at first, but pressure kept building. Writers and politicians pushed him, saying it was his duty to white America. Finally, in 1910, he accepted. He would be the Great White Hope, the man to defeat Johnson and return what they called order. The fight was set for July 4th, 1910, in Reno, Nevada. Independence Day. The meaning was obvious. The battle was described as a fight for American identity, for white pride, for what many believed was the soul of the nation. The build-up was enormous. News reporters covered every detail of training camps. Jeffries, older at 35 and heavier than before, struggled to get in shape. Johnson trained with confidence, calmly promising victory. The media ignored his confidence, certain Jeffries would still win despite age and years away from boxing. On the day of the match, more than 20,000 people gathered in Reno. Millions followed the updates by telegraph and news bulletins. This was more than a boxing match. It became a test of white superiority. The crowd loudly supported Jeffries and insulted Johnson. When he walked into the ring, the boos poured down like rain. Johnson simply smiled and waved, calm and unshaken. The bell rang, and from the early moments it was obvious Jeffries was struggling. 6 years of retirement had slowed him down. His reflexes were dull, his strength not the same. Johnson, strong and confident at 32, was faster, sharper, and far more powerful. He did not just beat Jeffries, he controlled him. For 15 rounds Johnson dominated, hitting him easily, speaking calmly to him and to the audience between blows. "Come on, Mr. Jeffries. Show me something." The smile never left his face. He was not only winning, he was enjoying proving them wrong. Finally, Jeffries' corner surrendered and threw in the towel. Johnson won by technical knockout. The Great White Hope had failed. The country exploded. Violence broke out across America. In more than 50 cities, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods. Over 20 people died, and many more were hurt. The rage was punishment for Johnson's victory, as if his success was a crime that required innocent people to suffer. In parts of the South, black Americans were killed for celebrating his win. The message was cruel and loud. A black man might hold the title, but the black community would be forced to pay for it. The government reacted by banning the film of the fight. Congress quickly passed a law to stop the fight footage from traveling across state lines. They could not undo the result, but they wanted to erase the proof. Johnson's celebration became quiet, not because he was afraid, but because his people were being attacked. He won, but every victory put him and his community in danger. Still, he refused to shrink or apologize. He stayed proud. Many fighters refused to face him after that. Those who did were older or not good enough. Johnson defended his title, but he could not get the important fights that would bring him true recognition. White boxers feared losing not just a match, but their pride and the anger of white society. Meanwhile, the government looked for a new way to break him. If they could not defeat him in the ring, they would use the law. In 1912, they charged him under the Mann Act, a law about transporting women across state lines for immoral reasons. The case focused on his relationship with Lucille Cameron, who later became his wife. When she refused to help bring him down, they found another woman, Belle Schreiber, and built a case around her instead. The courtroom became a stage. The trial was not about a crime, but about his life, his success, his refusal to be small. He was convicted in 1913 and sentenced to a year and a day in prison. Rather than accept it, he escaped the country and began 7 years of exile. He traveled through Europe and South America, still champion, but unable to return to his home. The title he earned with his fists turned into a chain that kept him away from his country. This was the cost of living free and proud in a nation that wanted him quiet. Before Johnson could return to America, he spent 7 years wandering foreign places, still the champion, but increasingly lonely, always chased by officials who wanted him behind bars. He left in 1913, first to Canada and then across Europe, always trying to stay ahead of those who wanted him arrested. He was still the best, still holding the world title, but everything was different. He could not defend the belt in America, the center of the sport. Instead, he fought smaller matches and exhibitions in places like Paris and Buenos Aires, always moving, never settled. In Paris, he found some freedom. The French cared less about race, and Johnson enjoyed the nightlife, the clubs, and the attention of high society. He performed in theaters, joined parties, and lived like a star. But under the shine was strain. He missed home, missed his community, and the constant travel drained him. Legal costs and life abroad slowly emptied his pockets. When World War I erupted in 1914, Europe became dangerous and unstable, pushing him again to new places like South America and Spain. He fought less often and not against the world's top fighters. By 1915, in his late 30s, he still had power, but age, stress, and endless trouble weighed on him. Still undefeated, still refusing to surrender, he held the title, but the world around him shrank. The United States pressed him from afar, using politics to block opportunities and make life harder in every country he entered. His ability to earn money grew smaller. The walls around him tightened bit by bit, not from fists in a ring, but from a system angry that he ever stood tall. Money was restricted. Promoters were hesitant to deal with a man on the run, especially one the American government wanted captured badly. By 1915, he was exhausted. Exhausted from running. Exhausted from battling outside the ring. Exhausted from being away from home and everything familiar. He started quiet talks with the Justice Department, hoping to arrange a return to America. He was willing to accept his punishment if he could return on his own terms with fair treatment. The government had no interest in compromise. They wanted him to surrender without conditions, to completely yield. He refused, holding on to whatever pride and leverage he still had. Then came Jess Willard, a huge white boxer from Kansas. Standing 6'6" and weighing more than 250 pounds, Willard was promoted as the newest great white hope. He wasn't especially skilled, but his size and strength made him threatening. More important than talent was the fact he was white and ready to face him. A fight was set for April 1915 in Havana, Cuba. The 26-round fight would decide the heavyweight crown. At 37, he was giving up youth, size, and reach, yet he still held the title and still believed he could win, or perhaps he only wanted to believe that. The events in Havana have been argued about for more than a century. Here is what is known. He controlled the early rounds, moving smoothly around Willard, landing punches with ease. But as the fight continued, his pace slowed. The Cuban heat was punishing, and endurance became key. Willard, younger and full of energy, kept pressing forward, taking damage but landing heavy blows too. By the 20th round, both fighters were exhausted. In the 26th round, Willard landed a strong right hand that sent him to the ground. He lay on his back, using his arm to block the sun from his eyes as the count reached 10. Jess Willard became the new heavyweight champion. The long-awaited Great White Hope had succeeded. White America celebrated, filled with relief after 7 years of refusing to accept a black champion. But almost instantly, whispers began. Did he throw the fight? A well-known photograph shows him on the canvas, looking strangely calm, his arm shading his face. It does not look like a man knocked senseless. It looks like someone who made a decision to remain down. Over the years, he told different versions. Sometimes he said Willard won honestly. Other times he hinted at a deal, implying he agreed to lose in exchange for mercy from the government. The truth is probably a mix. He was aging, worn by years of stress and exile. Willard was younger and fresher. He could simply have been beaten by time. Yet it is equally possible he saw a chance to end his fugitive life, to give white America the moment it demanded in exchange for a chance to return. Whether genuine or arranged, the result stood. He was no longer champion. The title he held for 7 years, the symbol of his defiance and greatness, was gone. Willard would later lose it to Jack Dempsey, who became a massive figure in boxing. His time at the top had ended. He finally returned to the United States in 1920 and surrendered. He served his sentence at Leavenworth Prison, working inside and putting on boxing shows for other inmates. When he was released after 10 months, he was 42, broke, and forgotten by many. The sport had moved past him, but he did not quit. He kept boxing into his 50s, taking any matches he could find, exhibitions and fights against younger men who saw him as a memory. He won some and lost others, but mostly he was simply trying to survive, earning whatever money he could. The fortune he once had was long gone, spent on legal battles, high expenses, and the price of exile. He did odd work, performed on stage, and told stories of his old days to anyone willing to listen. The man who once ruled the heavyweight world, who challenged the country and refused to bow, was now hustling for money and remembering what used to be. It was a fall as dramatic as his rise, a reminder of how swiftly fortune can shift and how harsh the world can be toward those who break its rules. Yet even in struggle, he kept his pride. He never apologized for who he had been, never expressed regret for living boldly. He lived by his own choices, paid for them, and never pretended he was wrong. That spirit, that refusal to surrender his identity, lasted until the end. To understand his legacy, we must see how his life spread outward, shaping sports, culture, and the idea of black masculinity in America. He died in 1946 in a car crash, speeding away from a restaurant in North Carolina that denied him service because of his race. Even at 68, he stayed defiant, still rejecting limits placed on him. His death came before major change in America, years before baseball's barrier fell, before civil rights victories, before the marches and voices that reshaped the country. He never lived to witness the results of the challenges he started. For many years after his death, his legacy caused debate. Inside the black community, opinions were split. He was honored as a barrier breaker who lived freely in a time when such freedom was dangerous. Others felt he took risks that brought suffering to others, that his boldness and relationships made white anger worse and created more hardship. The conflict was real. His actions had effects beyond himself. The riots after his wins, the backlash, and the way he was used to justify oppression affected many innocent people. Was it fair to blame him for racism? No, but the question of how to resist injustice and how publicly has always been difficult. In mainstream white America, he was largely ignored or seen as a troublemaker who met his fate. His championship years were often glossed over, historical accounts moving quickly to celebrate white fighters who followed. Only during the civil rights era did people start to look again. Activists and thinkers in the 60s and 70s saw him as a model of pride and independence. He lived without apology in a time when that was nearly impossible. He refused to let society define him or shrink him. Figures like Miles Davis and Muhammad Ali pointed to him as inspiration. Ali especially felt connected to him. He too spoke boldly, challenged the system, and was punished for it. He lost his title, spent time away from boxing, and faced government pressure. The similarities were clear, and Ali openly recognized them. In the 1970s, a major stage production about his life brought his story back to public attention, followed by a film that earned major awards recognition. People began to see him not as a warning, but as a tragic and heroic figure. Still, it took generations for full recognition. Over a century after his conviction, he finally received a formal pardon, a public acknowledgement that the case had been unjust and driven by prejudice. His influence on boxing remains undeniable. He transformed the sport, bringing defense, timing, and strategy into focus when most fighters simply traded punches. Every defensive master that came after carried pieces of his style. He proved black athletes could dominate at the highest level, paving the way for those who followed. Joe Louis became champion and was accepted by white America in ways he never was, but it was partly because Louis was guided to appear humble and quiet, the opposite approach. Louis followed rules he refused to live under. Whether that was better or worse depends on perspective. Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, and every black champion who came after walked through a door he forced open, even if many never fully realized how much he sacrificed so they could stand in the ring without asking permission. He was flawed, brilliant, stubborn, daring, reckless, visionary, and unstoppable in spirit. He paid a heavy price, but he carried himself in a way that made others believe they too could stand tall. Even if they chose different paths, even if they acted more cautiously, they lived in a world he changed with his fists, his courage, and his refusal to bow. They took different paths. Johnson had shown it was possible to become champion even when white America pushed back. That truth, that example mattered. But Johnson's influence stretched far beyond sports. He became one of the first widely known black public figures, someone whose fame crossed beyond his field. His way of living, his style, his cars, his businesses, his social life, all of it shaped an early example of what a black celebrity could look like, something many entertainers and athletes would later build upon and expand in their own ways. The artists of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, the musicians, writers, and painters who lifted up black culture and achievement, worked in a world that Johnson helped shape through his refusal to bow or shrink. His relationships with white women, while risky and controversial in his time, confronted one of white supremacy's most guarded barriers. The violence and outrage that followed his romances showed just how deeply many white Americans clung to racial separation, especially in intimate life. By refusing to hide, Johnson forced the nation to face its fears and contradictions. The anger directed at him was intense, but the confrontation he sparked left a lasting imprint. Johnson's life also revealed the limits of personal victory within a system built on discrimination. Even after reaching the very top of his profession, gaining fame and money, he still faced rejection, harassment, and targeted punishment. Restaurants still denied him entry, authorities still followed him, and the government still pursued him. His story made clear that success alone could not erase systemic injustice. Many black Americans who would later succeed in business, entertainment, or politics would come to learn the same painful truth: that being excellent does not always bring equal treatment. In modern times, Johnson's story still echoes in conversations about athlete activism and what society expects from black public figures. When Colin Kaepernick chose to kneel during the anthem, or when LeBron James spoke up about justice issues, they faced anger rooted in the same belief that black athletes should stay grateful and silent. The connection to Johnson is clear. He would not stay quiet, would not pretend to be humble to please others, and the nation punished him for it. The athletes and voices pushing for justice today follow a path he helped blaze, even if they never studied his life. Johnson's legacy also touches on the debate around respectability, the idea that oppressed people should behave perfectly to avoid mistreatment. Johnson dismissed this idea completely. He would not change himself to make others feel comfortable. He lived in the way he chose, and when punishment came, he did not beg or break. Some saw this as strong and inspiring. Others believed he acted without care for how his choices might affect other black people living under the same oppressive system. Both views have meaning, and the tension between them still appears in conversations about how to challenge unfair systems. Before praising Johnson as a symbol, we should remember he was a person who carried deep pain for choosing his path. The legend often hides the wounds he never fully escaped. His personal life was complex and often filled with sorrow. His relationships, especially with white women, shaped his public image and also brought deep emotional struggle. His first wife, Etta Durier, a woman from Brooklyn, loved him sincerely by many accounts. But the constant judgment, hostile gossip, and painful racism surrounding their marriage weighed heavily on her. Newspapers painted her as a woman who had betrayed her race. She lost friends, family support, and comfort. In 1912, she ended her life in their Chicago home while Johnson was away. Her death crushed him. He blamed himself for exposing her to pain she could not bear. The press showed almost no compassion, and some even suggested her death proved their hateful beliefs. Johnson grieved deeply, though he kept his strong exterior in public, likely because showing hurt would be seen as weakness. Months later, he married again to Lucille Cameron. Their marriage became the focus of his legal battles under the Mann Act. Lucille stayed with him through the trial and exile, but the stress, his affairs, and the demands of their life strained them. They separated in 1924. His third marriage to Irene Pinot in 1925 brought more steadiness, but still sat under the shadow of his past and constant financial pressure. Irene remained loyal and stayed with him until his death, facing hardship and obscurity beside him. As the years passed, the cost of his choices and the country's hostility became clear. His fortune disappeared, spent on legal battles, on sustaining his life abroad, and on trying to remain afloat after returning. He worked wherever he could, often in positions far beneath someone of his accomplishments. He appeared in small shows, worked at clubs, took whatever jobs would give him enough to live. A man once honored as world champion ended up performing just to earn his meals. The emotional weight was heavy too. Even after he served his sentence, officials continued to watch him. Police in different cities would arrest him for trivial or invented reasons, keeping him locked overnight simply to remind him of his place in society. The message followed him constantly. You may have been champion, but we will not let you forget the color of your skin. This life wore on him. Friends from earlier years said he often drifted into sadness, thinking about what he lost and how he had been treated. The bold, smiling fighter with unmatched confidence had become a man marked by decades of struggle and isolation. Still, he never publicly regretted who he had been. In interviews late in life, he defended his choices and his way of living. When asked if he would change anything, he said he would not. He had lived free, chosen love without fear, and refused to let others define him. The cost was steep, but bending to the world would have cost him something even greater: himself. This quiet dignity in the face of hardship may have been his greatest triumph. He also lived with the heavy thought that his victories and his defiance sometimes brought violence upon black communities. After some of his biggest wins, riots broke out and innocent people suffered. Even though this was not his doing, he carried the knowledge that his success had become a pretext for hateful retaliation. Some criticized him, saying he should have been more careful, more strategic, more cautious in a world eager to punish black progress. These accusations wounded him, as he understood all too well the impossible position he occupied. He was a symbol whether he wanted to be or not, and symbols carry burdens beyond their own lives. In his later years, loneliness surrounded him. The boxing world moved on. Younger fighters took the spotlight. Johnson would sometimes attend matches quietly, sitting among everyday fans who had no idea that the older man near them once ruled the heavyweight ring. People who once praised him drifted away when the fame and money disappeared. He was left on the fringes of the sport he helped shape. His body weakened over time. Long years in the ring and the stress of his life took their toll. Yet he stayed restless, unable to settle into quiet old age. He still drove fast, still chased sparks of energy, still lived with the same stubborn pride. In June of 1946, after being denied service at a diner in North Carolina simply because of his race, he left angry, drove at high speed, and crashed into a pole. He later died at a segregated hospital, placed in the colored ward, even in his final hours treated as less. He was 68. His funeral in Chicago drew mostly members of the black community who had not forgotten him. Major newspapers barely mentioned his passing, and boxing writers offered only short notes. A man who once stood at the peak of fame was laid to rest quietly, marked by a simple stone. For a long time his grave saw few visitors, until history slowly began to give him proper recognition. Now, those who understand what he represented sometimes visit to honor him. The price of his path was enormous: a lost wife, lost fortune, years in exile, poverty, constant attacks, and isolation. Yet when looking at his full life, it becomes difficult to argue that he should have lived differently. Would apology or obedience have protected him? History shows otherwise. Joe Louis tried to be the model citizen, quiet and polite, and even he faced racism and died with financial trouble. The truth was clear. The society of their time was not ready to reward black greatness, no matter how it behaved. Johnson chose freedom, and he suffered for it, but he also lived fully on his own terms. He refused to be made small, and that choice, costly as it was, remains one of the most meaningful acts of defiance in American history, and the weight it carried shaped his life and his legacy. Before he could ever become a symbol of resistance, he first had to exist as a real, breathing challenge to every belief white America held about black strength, intelligence, and value. He did not simply fight inside a ring. His whole life was a fight. By living boldly, he altered how many black Americans thought about themselves and what they could demand from the world. In the early 1900s, the accepted idea of a successful black man was tight and restrictive. The leading black voices of that period encouraged calm progress. They pushed the idea that black Americans should focus on economic growth, skilled training, and proving their worth through steady effort and polite behavior. They believed that if black people showed discipline and good character, white America would eventually grant fairness and equal standing. He represented something very different. He did not ask for permission, did not wait for approval from white society, and did not think he needed to prove his humanity. He lived on his own terms and dared anyone to challenge him. That spirit was groundbreaking. For Black Americans living under harsh segregation, taught since childhood to stay quiet and careful, his way of moving through life was inspiring and frightening at the same time. He showed what was possible but also revealed how heavy the cost could be. In black barbershops and churches, on street corners and in small meeting rooms, his career was discussed endlessly. Some called him a champion and a brave figure. Others thought he caused danger for everyone with his boldness. Some people thought his defiance invited backlash that fell on innocent people. Others felt pride that someone refused to bow. These debates were powerful. They showed a community wrestling with questions of identity, strategy, and dignity. His life forced those conversations simply by being lived so openly. His influence stretched far beyond the ring. He became a symbol of style and confidence. His custom suits, his cars, his flair for living well created an image of black excellence that many admired. In cities like Harlem and Chicago, young men copied his look and his posture, trying to capture a bit of his bold spirit. The artistic explosion, later known as the Harlem Renaissance, grew partly in the atmosphere he helped create. Writers, musicians, painters, and thinkers built on the wave of confidence he stirred. He proved black achievement could shine on the world stage, demand attention, and refuse invisibility. Musicians especially felt connected to him. The fearless way he lived, refusing to hide, matched the spirit of early jazz. Jazz broke rules too. It was creative, unpredictable, deeply rooted in black experience yet reaching for universal meaning. Both his life and jazz music represented a new voice of black expression that did not apologize for existing. Writers of that era mentioned him openly or used characters shaped by him. The new idea of the new Negro, strong, proud, and unwilling to accept limits, was partly built on his example. These artists were defining a new identity, one based on pride rather than apology, boldness instead of quiet patience. And he stood as proof that such identity could exist in real life, not only in books or poems. But his influence did not stay in art and literature. It reached ordinary life. In everyday places where black people gathered, his victories were celebrated and his life examined. He became part of community storytelling. People shared tales about him, sometimes exaggerated, but always filled with admiration for his refusal to bow. His story also revealed class tensions inside Black America. More conservative leaders often disliked his behavior. They believed respectability and careful steps would lead to progress, and thought his bold nature made life harder for everyone. Working-class black Americans, however, often saw him as one of their own, someone who rose from little and refused to be told what to do by anyone. One area where he provoked the most debate came from his personal choices. In a time when many laws and customs controlled personal relationships, he did not hide his life or ask permission. This was more than personal choice. It challenged deep beliefs and exposed the fear at the core of racial control. The anger he faced showed that racism was not only about money or public space, but also about controlling personal freedom and emotion. Some people later argued that his choices were brave and broke unfair boundaries. Others believed his behavior ignored the emotional cost for black women during that era. The truth is complex, but what remains clear is that his life forced conversations about personal freedom, equality, and dignity. These discussions continue in different forms even today. He also deeply shaped black athletes' understanding of themselves. Before him, successful black athletes were expected to appear grateful and humble. He showed another road, confident, proud, and unwilling to be small. Later athletes either followed his spirit or reacted against it. One famous champion chose a quieter, polite approach specifically to avoid the same backlash. Another great champion embraced his bold energy, spoke openly, and paid a similar price in exile and criticism. The connection between them is undeniable, and many have admitted they studied his story. Modern athletes still deal with the same questions. Can they speak openly, stand strong, and challenge injustice, or must they stay quiet and pleasing? The echo of his life is heard every time an athlete chooses truth over silence and faces backlash for it. His cultural effect was larger than sports. It was about personal freedom, self-definition, and the right to exist without shrinking. This is why his memory matters beyond titles or trophies. He widened what was possible for Black Americans. He showed that rules built to confine could be broken, that dignity was not something granted by others, but something claimed by living boldly. Before understanding his full cultural role, one must understand how he transformed boxing itself. He was not only a champion, he was an inventor inside the ring. In a time when heavyweights simply stood and traded blows, believing toughness meant absorbing pain, he introduced a new science to the sport. He believed that skill mattered as much as strength. He valued not getting hit as much as landing a blow. His movement, footwork, and control of distance were remarkable for a man of his size. He circled, pivoted, and slipped punches with grace. He turned defense into art. Fighters before him relied mostly on force. He relied on timing, patience, awareness, and strategy. His positioning, his calm in chaos, and his understanding of space were groundbreaking. He frustrated opponents, making them tired, angry, and careless. Instead of rushing forward blindly, he waited for perfect moments and struck with precision. In doing so, he changed boxing from a raw battle into a smart, tactical sport. Many who came after him built on his methods, even if they did not always say his name aloud. His control of the ring reflected his control of life. Calm, strategic, unafraid, he showed that intelligence and confidence could overcome brute force. And through that, he taught countless people, inside and outside the ring, that true power comes not from pleasing others or obeying limits, but from knowing who you are and refusing to shrink from it, and timing instead of only blocking or slipping. He would make opponents miss by inches, saving his strength while frustrating them deeply. Then, when they were off balance or tired, he would answer with exact, sharp punches. This patient defensive craft came from intelligence. He studied every opponent seriously. If he could find earlier fights, he would watch them, noticing habits and repeated moves. In early rounds, he observed calmly, letting opponents reveal their plans before shifting his own style. One rival once said that fighting him felt like trying to hit a shadow. You'd think you finally cornered him, throw your strongest strike, and he simply was not there anymore. Then in a sudden moment, you would feel his glove land clean, and you would stand confused, wondering how he appeared so quickly. This was intellect mixed with instinct. He also understood the mind of a fighter and used it. In the ring he spoke, teased, challenged the pride of the man in front of him. He questioned their courage and confidence. "Come on, is that all you got? You can hit stronger than that." The grin he showed while being hit was not just expression, it was strategy. While fists met his cheek or jaw, he smiled, making aggressive men feel powerless. Imagine throwing everything you have and seeing your opponent grin back as if nothing touched him. This destroyed spirits. Many fighters gave their best efforts only to see him smirk and request more. The famous photo of him over a fallen opponent shows this truth. One man collapsed, the other standing calm and almost casual, as if the result had never been in doubt. That moment captured his entire nature, relaxed, sure of himself, always holding control. Inside fighting was another area where he stood ahead of his time. When rivals closed distance, he wrapped them up, limiting their swings and draining their strength. He leaned his weight on them, making them carry him while their energy faded. Then he released, stepped back, and landed clean combinations before they regained balance. It was not flashy movement, but it was brutally efficient. He allowed aggressive fighters to tire themselves, then punished them piece by piece. His jab was like a compass and a hammer combined. It measured space, interrupted rhythm, and slowly wore men down. A jab may not look frightening alone, but when delivered hundreds of times over long rounds, it breaks a face, bruises the spirit, and turns strong hearts heavy. He treated boxing like a long journey instead of a short sprint. Many of his contests stretched deep into the late rounds, far beyond what is common today. Because of that, stamina and pace mattered. He rarely rushed early. Instead, he moved with comfort, breathed patiently, watched, waited. If an opponent attacked wildly hoping for a fast victory, he endured, defended, survived the storm. Then, as minutes passed and lungs burned, he began to control everything. His strength was quiet, not the kind that ends fights in a single blow. Instead, it built up. He delivered clean shots again and again until bodies broke and minds bent. The stoppage came not from one explosion, but from steady pressure, like waves wearing down stone. His uppercut was especially dangerous. With long arms and clever timing, he snapped it upward where rivals could not see it coming. It lifted heads, shook legs, and destroyed confidence. His balance was nearly perfect. Even while punching or stepping backward, he stayed centered. He never left openings without reason, always kept hands ready and chin safe. At a time when many fighters swung wildly and relied on toughness, he trained himself to be efficient and careful. But beyond talent, his true gift was flexibility. He could box lightly or press heavily. Against wild attackers, he became calm and slippery. Against slow and thoughtful fighters, he grew aggressive, pushing them backward, showing his physical strength. No one style defined him. Every challenger faced a different version, which made preparing for him almost impossible. Experts who watch his old footage today see modern skill in an early era. Defense, strategy, mind games, footwork, ring awareness, energy control. All the qualities seen in champions decades later appeared in his craft first. He created new standards because he had no choice. He understood that society and referees might not treat him fairly. Bias could rob him of victory unless he proved himself clearly superior. So he built a system that reduced risk, punished mistakes, and left little room for doubt. He needed to outthink and outperform by such a wide margin that opinion could not erase excellence. Sadly, for a long time, the genius of his style was overshadowed by the prejudice wrapped around his life. People debated his personal choices and his defiance more than they praised his mastery. But real historians who study the sport acknowledge him as one of the greatest defensive geniuses ever. A strategist whose ideas influenced generations, a pioneer who showed that a smart fighter could defeat a strong fighter, that calm planning beats reckless force, that fighting is not just hitting, but thinking. Many legends learned from him. Some took his footwork, some his patience, some his ability to control emotion in the ring. But before the system could truly crush him, it needed to build a weapon powerful enough. The law that became the tool against him was originally presented as a way to stop exploitation, yet it became a tool to attack men whose relationships did not fit society's prejudice at the time. Once he became champion, powerful forces searched endlessly for a reason to destroy him. Local police tried different accusations, but nothing worked. When this federal law appeared, it became the sword they needed. Authorities first attempted to use it soon after his marriage, but the woman stood by him and refused to betray their relationship, and the case fell apart. When that attempt failed, they searched until they found someone willing to speak against him. Even though the events supposedly in question happened before the law existed, they pushed forward, showing they cared more about punishment than fairness. courtrooms turned into theaters of judgment. Instead of focusing on evidence, they pointed at his lifestyle, his confidence, his success, his boldness in living life on his own terms. They painted him as danger rather than competitor. His lawyers argued the truth, that it was unfair and targeted, but the outcome was already written in the minds of those judging him. The sentence came. Instead of surrendering immediately, he left, first across borders and then across oceans. For years he lived away from home, always watched, always chased. Officials around the world were warned of his presence, urged to monitor him. The effort spent pursuing him for a so-called moral violation was unlike anything seen before. It showed that his victory in the ring was not the only battle he fought. His real crime in their eyes was never breaking a rule, it was breaking expectations. He did not bow, did not hide, did not shrink. And so the world around him used every tool to try to force him back into a place he refused to accept. Even in exile, he kept moving, fighting, performing, living on his terms as long as he could. And though the system eventually captured him, it never truly defeated him, because time revealed the truth. Today, more people see the brilliance of his craft, the courage in his spirit, and the unfairness of the attacks he faced. He showed what greatness looks like when the world tries to silence it. Strength with intelligence, confidence without apology. A man who mastered not just punches, but patience, strategy, and presence. His influence did not end with one era. Every fighter who uses defense as weapon, every boxer who studies film, every champion who smiles under pressure stands in the shadow of the one who did it first and did it bravely. He proved that greatness can rise even when the world tries to push it down, and that true power is not only in force, but in mind, discipline, and the calm certainty of one who knows his worth, even when others refuse to see it. Fighter showed the level of force and pressure used against him. At the same time, many people understood that the case built by the government against Johnson was not truly fair or honest. Some legal experts spoke up, saying the charges felt politically driven and legally weak. Black newspapers followed the story closely, highlighting the clear racial double standard. White men transported women across state lines for bad or immoral reasons all the time, without ever facing charges. The law was being used in a special way only for Johnson, because he was black and would not bow his head or act small about his success. Yet even with all this criticism, nothing changed. No reconsideration, no pause. Johnson stayed a fugitive, unable to safely return home without being locked away. The message from the government was clear and sharp. A black man could earn fame, win respect, make money, and rise high, but if he pushed too far beyond what society expected, the full weight of the state would be brought down to crush him. When Johnson finally returned to America in 1920 and turned himself in, he was treated like any other prisoner. The once world heavyweight champion, a man who had been celebrated in cities around the globe, now stood in line to be fingerprinted, photographed, and sent to Leavenworth Prison. Though his time behind bars was not the harshest possible by federal prison standards, it was still confinement. He worked in the physical training area, trained other prisoners in boxing, and even received some respect from prison officials who knew how famous he was. But the truth remained. He was still locked up, still punished, still paying for something that existed mostly so the government could target him. After 10 months, he was released. Yet the conviction stayed with him forever, a permanent stamp used to weaken his legacy and shade his name. Whenever his boxing career was remembered, the conviction was tied to his story, often mentioned loudly, almost as if it were equal to his victories in the ring. This was not an accident. It was done so people would never simply call him a champion. They wanted the world to remember him as a criminal who dared to rise too high. The case against him was not only about him. It sent a message to every black person in America. There is a limit to how high you are allowed to climb. And if you try to step past it, even if you are brilliant, talented, and victorious, the system will make sure to strike you down. Fame cannot protect you. Success does not protect you. Excellence does not save you when power feels threatened. The lessons from this did not disappear. The next generation watched. Joe Louis, who became champion in 1937, was carefully guided to avoid Johnson's fate. He was coached to appear humble, always polite, always safe. He was told plainly not to take pictures with white women, not to boast after winning, not to give white America any reason to turn against him. And it worked in a very different way for Louis. He was accepted, even loved by many white Americans. He became a symbol during World War II, but he had to act within the lines drawn for him. He had to play a part. He had to be the acceptable version, the quiet version, the gentle version. He became what society demanded, while Johnson refused to bend. This contrast alone shows how strong the punishment against Johnson really was. One man lived proudly and suffered heavily, and the one who came after him learned he must act smaller to survive. In 2018, long after Johnson's death, a pardon was finally given. It arrived more than a century after his conviction. It was meant as a public recognition that what was done to him had been wrong. It was called a disgrace that a man of his talent and courage had been treated this way. Many people, including famous advocates and historians, had fought for this moment. But a pardon after death, while symbolic, cannot undo a life lived under the mark of an unfair judgment. Johnson still lived and died as a convicted man. His story still carried the stain forced upon him, and his memory was shaped by injustice more than justice. The apology came long after it could help him. What happened to Johnson stands as one of the clearest examples of the legal system being turned into a weapon against someone simply because he would not shrink himself. He did not commit a real crime in the spirit of the law. His true crime was being visible, proud, brilliant, and unstoppable while being black. The law was twisted, applied unevenly, and powered by deep prejudice. And he paid the price so the system could show others what happens when someone refuses to stay in their place. So now, more than 100 years after he beat Tommy Burns and shattered the barrier people said could never fall, we look again at what his story really means. His life asks us questions that still matter today. His story reminds us that change begins when someone refuses to accept unfair rules. He did not accept being locked out of opportunity. He pushed through when everyone said he could not. Many times in history, great changes happen only when one person is willing to stand alone and pay the price. Every broken barrier demanded courage from someone willing to suffer for it. Johnson's story shows that personal strength and resolve matter, even when the world fights you at every step. His story also challenges the idea that if you behave perfectly, you will be treated fairly. Many argued at the time that Johnson should have been quieter, more humble, more cautious. They believed if he acted gently enough, if he smiled the right way, if he shrank himself just a little, maybe the world would have accepted him. But history has shown that this belief is false. There were many black Americans who were humble and kind and still faced hate, laws, violence, and exclusion. The issue was not his personality. The issue was a system determined to keep people in place. And even now, debates continue about protest, behavior, and who deserves to be heard. The burden always seems to fall on the oppressed to be calm, polite, and quiet, even when injustice is loud and cruel. And there is another lesson about success. Johnson reached the very top of his field, lived a life of great skill and ability, and still could not escape discrimination. He could win global matches and still be denied a seat in a restaurant. He could defeat champions and still be followed by the government. His life shows that personal excellence alone cannot remove deep-rooted injustice. Real change needs more than individual brilliance. It requires community effort, laws that are fair, and a culture that truly wants equality rather than control. His prosecution also teaches how law can be used as a tool of power. The law was not used to protect society. It was used to punish someone powerful people feared. And this method still appears in different forms today when certain groups face harsher scrutiny, harsher sentences, and harsher judgment because of who they are and where they come from. In the end, Johnson's life shows the price of staying true to oneself. He chose pride over fear. He chose freedom over safety. He chose to live boldly even though it meant struggle, exile, and hardship. Some will debate whether it was worth it, but Johnson himself made his choice with full heart. He lived as he wished, not as others demanded. He carried both the glory and the pain of that decision, expression over acceptance. Sixth, there is a lesson about historical erasure and slow rediscovery. Johnson was intentionally pushed out of boxing memory, his achievements muted, his greatness buried under talk of his conviction rather than his mastery. It took long years of effort from historians, activists, and supporters to bring his story back forward and return him to his rightful place in sports history. This reminds us that history is often a struggle, that voices pushed to the edges can disappear unless someone fights to bring them back, and that reclaiming truth demands steady, intentional work. Seventh, Johnson's relationship with the black community shows the complicated nature of representation. He was at once a symbol of pride and a source of discomfort, celebrated and questioned at the same time. That very same tension around representation, how public figures from marginalized backgrounds are seen, and the heavy weight placed on their shoulders, is still present today. Black athletes, entertainers, and public figures still face the pressure of representing millions, of being themselves while also being safe, respectable, and calm enough not to cause fear in the minds of others. Eighth, his life reminds us that progress is not simple, smooth, or guaranteed. He became champion in 1908, breaking a wall many believed would never fall. But the reaction was fierce and brutal. After he lost the title, it took over 2 decades for another black heavyweight champion to rise. Breaking into a space does not always mean staying there. Steps forward can be pushed backward. Hard-won opportunities can be taken again. Holding ground takes constant alertness. Ninth, there is a message about allyship and quiet complicity. Tommy Burns, though champion, faced strong pressure to avoid Johnson and eventually agreed to fight only for money. Some promoters and journalists supported Johnson's right to compete. But the overwhelming majority of white society either loudly opposed him or stayed quietly comfortable in their silence. This shows us that wrongdoing survives not only through open hatred, but also through stillness, through those who could help yet decide to do nothing. 10th, and perhaps above all, Johnson shows that dignity does not require permission. He walked through life as if he already deserved respect even when society tried to take it. He lived boldly even when boldness was considered unacceptable. He refused to let the hatred around him shape his spirit. He did not believe the false stories told about his worth or his ability. That unbroken belief in himself, in the middle of constant disrespect, might be his strongest legacy. For young people today, especially young Black Americans, his life offers lessons that are complex and real. He proves that barriers can be cracked, that talent and excellence eventually force recognition, and that living true to yourself is possible even when it demands sacrifice. But he also shows the heavy cost of challenging the world, the isolation that follows, those who stand alone, the strange quiet that comes when you walk a road no one else dares to walk. Johnson's life shows us that change rarely grows from comfort. It rises through tension, through those who keep speaking when silence is expected. Every era has its Jack Johnson figures. Men and women who speak too boldly, walk too proudly, and refuse to shrink or apologize for occupying spaces they were never supposed to stand in. They are punished first, praised later. The pattern is so steady it feels almost like a rule written in time. And yet because of them, the borders move a little. Because of them, ideas once called impossible slowly become normal. The color lines in sports, in culture, in politics shift because someone chose to pay the price to push them. Johnson's triumph was not only inside a ring, it was a reflection held up to a nation, forcing it to see its wounds and contradictions. More than 100 years later, that reflection has not disappeared. When athletes kneel peacefully, when musicians and artists speak truth, when ordinary people refuse to beg for equality and instead demand fair treatment, the echo of Jack Johnson can be felt, the steady beat of a person who refused to lower his head. His story offers each of us a quiet question. When your moment arrives, when you face pressure to bend, will you go along softly or will you stand, steady and stubborn on your own terms? Before Jack Johnson became an icon, he was simply a man, flawed, brilliant, stubborn, proud. After his passing, his name would not stay hidden. It rose again, and again. Each generation found new meaning in his life, new reason to remember him. In the glowing rooms of Harlem jazz clubs, people spoke his name between songs. The boxer who lived with dignity and strength when dignity for black men was denied. In the 1960s, when Muhammad Ali stood before cameras and declared that no one could force him into a war he did not believe was right, observers compared him immediately to Johnson. Ali did not reject that idea. He once said, "I am the Jack Johnson of my time." The same boldness, the same punishment, the same unwillingness to apologize. In the 1970s, James Earl Jones carried Johnson's spirit on stage in The Great White Hope, and audiences watched in silence, realizing they were not only seeing a boxer's tale, but the story of a man crushed and tested for daring to be whole. Years passed, and filmmakers, historians, fighters, and thinkers still trace their influence back to him. Every defensive boxer who plays with footwork and timing, every athlete who carries confidence society tries to restrict, every public figure who refuses to shrink themselves to make others comfortable, they carry a piece of Johnson's shadow and light. Yet Johnson's story is not only about pride or victory. It is about the cost of honesty in a world ready to punish anyone who refuses to hide. He never lived to witness the public pardon that cleared his name. He did not see the museums place his gloves behind glass like precious treasures. But in truth, he never needed those symbols. His deepest victory was never a belt or a trophy. It was the truth that once a person understands their value, no system, no rule, no crowd, no government can make them forget it. Even today, one photograph remains. Johnson standing tall above a fallen opponent, calm and steady, as if the scene had been written before the fighting even began. That image has outlasted every critic and every hateful headline. It survives because it shows something timeless, a human being who refused to accept a small place, and by doing so widened the world for everyone who came after. Jack Johnson's steady heartbeat still exists in every athlete who speaks up, in every artist who refuses to bend, in every soul who dares to live without shame or apology. The laughter that once mocked him has faded into quiet dust. What remains is the memory of boldness, the soft echo of gloves meeting canvas, and the clear truth he carved more than a century ago. They laughed at him until the world, slowly and unwillingly at first, had no option left but to rise and applaud.